Evan Hale always claimed he wasn't the kind of person who made reckless decisions, but that afternoon, standing in the fading light of a winter-orange sky, he realized he had become someone he barely recognized. The words he had just thrown at the black lantern still echoed in his mind, louder than the street noise around him. I challenge you. Break me if you can. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't defiance. It was desperation shrouded in a thin shell of boldness, and Evan felt its weight pressing against his ribs as he stood alone before the group known for their cold, merciless demeanor that he didn't even fully understand why he had said it. Maybe it was the weeks of silence at home with Marcus Voss, the man he loved but could no longer seem to reach. Maybe it was the hollow feeling that had begun spreading in his chest every time Marcus walked past him without meeting his eyes. Or maybe it was the quiet fear that had begun whispering that he was no longer enough for the person he had built his life around. Whatever the reason, Evan knew one thing with certainty: he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The alley behind Bridgeway Market was narrow, uneven, and dim, lit only by a flickering sign from an old coffee shop and the last slivers of daylight. The gang stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions ranging from amusement to mild curiosity. No one moved at first. They simply stared at him, as if waiting for him to explain himself, or collapse under the weight of his own impulsivity, and then Evan noticed someone he hadn't seen when he first stepped into the alley. A man stood slightly apart from the group, leaning against a brick wall with the relaxed posture of someone who had nothing to prove. His presence was quiet but commanding. His eyes, a sharp gray that reflected everything and revealed nothing, were fixed directly on Evan. Calder Knox. Evan didn't know his name yet, but something about the man unsettled him. There was a calm confidence in Calder's stance, a kind of silent authority that the others seemed to defer to without question. His dark jacket was unbuttoned despite the cold, and his expression remained unreadable, neither hostile nor welcoming. Just watchful. Evan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had come here in a moment of anger, fueled by the ache of feeling invisible in his own home. Marcus had left that morning with barely a nod in Evan's direction, offering a clipped "later" that sounded more like an obligation than affection. Evan had watched Marcus's back disappear through the door and had felt something break quietly inside him. He didn't know if Marcus was drifting away or simply exhausted, but he had known something was wrong. And instead of confronting it, he had run out into the world searching for a way to feel anything other than numb. One of the black lanterns, a tall man with a shaved head and a deep scar cutting across his eyebrow, stepped toward him. Break you? He repeated, his tone half mocking, half curious. You walk in here alone and ask for that? You sure you're in the right place? Evan kept his gaze steady, though he could feel his pulse hammering inside his wrists. I'm exactly where I meant to be. The shaved-head man laughed, shaking his head. You're either brave or stupid. Before Evan could respond, Calder pushed off the wall with deliberate ease and walked toward him. The other men stepped aside without being told. Calder stopped just close enough that Evan could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the calm in his eyes, the subtle trace of something like interest, though Evan couldn't be sure. You don't know what you're asking, Calder said quietly. His voice wasn't threatening. It was measured, almost gentle, but there was an undeniable edge beneath it. People come here wanting trouble. They usually regret finding it. I'm not looking for trouble, Evan replied. I just want something real. Calder's expression flickered, barely, but enough for Evan to notice. And you think we're the ones who can give you that? Evan hesitated. He didn't know how to explain the storm inside him, the loneliness, the frustration, the fear that he was losing Marcus without understanding why. So he said nothing. Calder exhaled slowly, studying him. You're running from something. That much is obvious. The word struck deeper than Evan expected. He felt exposed, as if Calder could see the cracks he tried so hard to keep hidden. Still, he forced a small, tight smile. Maybe I am. For a long moment, the alley was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Calder's gaze didn't waver. Then he turned slightly toward the others and gave a subtle shake of his head. The message was clear: leave him alone. But he challenged us, someone began. He didn't know what he was stepping into. Calder interrupted, his tone final. This isn't his world. Evan bristled at that. You don't get to decide that. No, Calder said softly, but someone should stop you from making a mistake you'll regret. The sincerity in his voice took Evan by surprise. He wasn't used to strangers recognizing his pain, let alone acknowledging it. He felt something shift, a small crack of uncertainty forming in his resolve, then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Evan didn't have to look to know who it was. Marcus. The timing was sharp enough to feel like fate, or maybe punishment. He froze, torn between instinct and resentment. Calder's eyes flicked down to Evan's pocket, then back to his face. You should take that, Calder said, though his tone suggested he already knew Evan wouldn't. Evan didn't move. Calder studied him for another moment, then stepped back. Go home, Evan. Whatever you're fighting, this isn't where you'll win. Evan's breath hitched. How do you know my name? A faint hint of a smile crossed Calder's lips. I make it my business to know who walks into danger. Before Evan could respond, Calder turned away, and the rest of the black lanterns followed him, dispersing like shadows melting back into the dim alley. Evan stood alone once more, the silence pressing in around him. His phone buzzed again, persistent but unanswered. Marcus's name glowed on the screen, but Evan couldn't bring himself to tap it. Not yet. His heartbeat finally began to slow, but his mind did not. Calder's words lingered, circling inside him with unsettling clarity. That you're running from something. Maybe Calder was right. Evan slipped his phone back into his pocket, exhaled shakily, and took a step toward the street. He didn't know what he had expected to find here, but the encounter had left him with more questions than answers, and a strange, lingering pull he couldn't explain. As he walked away, the cold evening air brushed against his skin, carrying with it a subtle whisper of uncertainty and the quiet promise that tonight had changed something he wasn't ready to name. And somewhere behind him, hidden in the depths of the alley, Calder Knox watched until Evan disappeared from sight. Evan Hale woke the next morning with a strange heaviness in his chest, the kind that follows a night filled with unfinished thoughts. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dim alley, the silent semicircle of the black lanterns, and Calder Knox's steady, unreadable gaze. The memory clung to him with an unsettling persistence, as if something in that encounter had been left open, unresolved, unspoken, demanding attention he wasn't ready to give. Marcus Voss stood in the kitchen when Evan entered, already dressed for the day. The smell of burnt toast hung in the air. Marcus's back was turned, but even his posture felt defensive, like he was bracing himself for a conversation he didn't want to have. You didn't answer my calls last night, Marcus said without turning around. Evan swallowed, his throat tight. I know. I was out. Doing what? Marcus asked, his voice steady but flat. The question was fair, but Evan still flinched at the tone. It wasn't anger, it was distance wearing the shape of a question. Just, clearing my head. Marcus finally faced him, and his expression was unreadable in the same way Evan had once found mysterious, even attractive. Now it felt like a wall. You've been doing that a lot lately. Evan looked down at the counter, tracing a small scratch with his fingertip. Maybe because things haven't felt right. Marcus didn't reply. Instead, he picked up his keys and slipped them into his pocket. I'll be late tonight. Board meeting. The word stung more than Evan expected. They had once shared everything, jokes, fears, dreams, even silence. Now Evan felt like an afterthought. He forced a nod. Right. Okay. Marcus paused at the door, as if considering saying something else, but the moment passed. The door clicked shut behind him. Evan stood alone in the kitchen, the taste of unspoken questions filling the quiet space. He wanted to chase after Marcus, to pull him close and demand honesty, or offer it. But something inside him wouldn't move. Something was stuck, and that something had gray eyes and a voice that whispered truths Evan wasn't ready to confront. By midday, Evan found himself wandering through Riverside Park, hands buried in his jacket pockets. The trees swayed gently, scattering yellow leaves across the pavement in lazy spirals. Families strolled past, couples sat on benches sharing coffee, joggers weaved through footpaths with practiced rhythm. Life moved easily around him, but Evan felt suspended, hovering between guilt and longing without knowing where to land. That he had told himself he wouldn't think about Calder Knox again, but that had lasted no more than an hour. Calder's words echoed relentlessly, "You're running from something." Evan wasn't sure if Calder meant Marcus, himself, or both. He was deep in thought when someone stepped into his path, forcing him to stop. Evan's breath caught. Calder. He stood in the soft shade of a maple tree, wearing a dark sweater that contrasted sharply with the late afternoon glow. His expression was unreadable, as it had been the night before, but something in his eyes suggested this wasn't a coincidence. "You have a habit of wandering into places alone," Calder said quietly. Evan's heart thudded once, hard. "How did you find me?" Calder shrugged lightly. "I wasn't looking. You just seemed to show up where I happened to be." Evan didn't believe that, but he didn't press. There was something oddly comforting about Calder's presence, though he knew it shouldn't be. Evan glanced around, half expecting the black lanterns, but Calder sensed his worry and shook his head. "They're not here," he said. "This isn't about them." Evan inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. "Then what is it about?" Calder studied him with a focus that made Evan feel seen, truly seen, in a way Marcus hadn't made him feel in months. "You looked lost last night," Calder said. "And you look even more lost today." Evan felt heat rise to his face. "You don't know me." "No," Calder agreed, "but I knew what pain looks like long before you walked into that alley." The honesty in his tone unsettled Evan. "Why do you care?" Calder's gaze softened, though only slightly. "Maybe because you're not the kind of person who belongs in darkness. You were trying to hurt yourself without realizing it." Evan exhaled shakily. He had no defense for that. It was true. They walked slowly along the path, neither speaking for several moments. The silence between them felt strangely natural, unforced. "You're with someone," Calder said at last. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Evan replied. "Marcus. And you love him?" Evan hesitated, the pause speaking louder than words. "I do," he finally said, "but something's wrong between us. He's distant. Cold. And I keep thinking it's my fault." Calder's jaw tightened slightly, a reaction Evan couldn't decipher. "And instead of facing him, you threw yourself at a gang like you were hoping they'd give you clarity?" Evan gave a weak, humorless laugh. "Something like that." Calder stopped walking and turned to face him. "Evan, be honest with yourself. You're not chasing danger. You're chasing a feeling." Evan swallowed hard. "And what feeling is that?" "Being wanted." The word struck him with painful precision. Evan's breath trembled, and he had no response, not because Calder was wrong, but because he was painfully right. He stepped back, needing distance, but Calder didn't move toward him. He didn't take advantage of the emotional vulnerability hanging between them. Instead, he let Evan breathe. "You should talk to Marcus," Calder said gently. "Before this becomes something you can't come back from." Something you can't come back from. The implication lingered in the space between them, delicate, dangerous, unresolved. Evan nodded, though his chest tightened. "I know." Calder's expression softened just enough to reveal a flicker of warmth. "Good." Evan turned away, preparing to leave, but before he took a step, Calder's voice reached him. "And Evan?" He looked back. Calder's eyes held something unspoken, something that made Evan's breath catch again. "You're not as invisible as you think." Evan walked away with a heart full of conflict, guilt toward Marcus, a growing pull toward Calder, and a realization that he was standing at the edge of a choice that would change everything. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, stretching long shadows across the path as Evan disappeared into the quiet of the evening, leaving Calder standing alone among falling leaves. Evan Hale spent the rest of the evening pacing the living room, the lights dimmed low enough to make the apartment feel smaller than it was. Every shadow, every quiet corner reminded him of someone, Marcus with his lingering silences, Calder with his unsettling clarity. Evan felt caught between two versions of himself, the one who wanted desperately to fix what was broken and the one who feared it might already be too late. When the front door finally clicked open, Evan's heart tightened. Marcus Voss stepped inside, exhaling as he set down his briefcase. His expression held exhaustion, but beneath it was something harder to read, wariness, perhaps, or the residue of guilt. "You're home early," Marcus said, though his voice lacked surprise. "I needed to talk," Evan said. The words felt thick, like he was pushing them through a narrow space. "We need to talk." Marcus closed the door slowly. "I figured that." For a moment they simply stood there, separated by a few feet of hardwood floor but miles of unspoken truths. The silence stretched until Evan felt it pressing against his ribs. "Marcus, what's going on?" Evan asked. "You've been distant for weeks. You hardly look at me anymore, you barely touch me, and you always have somewhere else to be." Marcus rubbed his forehead, the gesture betraying a tension he normally kept tightly concealed. "Evan, it's not that simple." "Then make it simple," Evan said, his voice trembling slightly. "Please." Marcus hesitated before answering. "I'm behind on a major project. If I don't fix it, I could lose everything I've worked for." Evan blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected that. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to worry," Marcus said. "And because I didn't want you to think I was failing." Evan stepped forward. "You're my partner. You shouldn't have to carry things alone." Marcus looked at him then, really looked, and Evan saw a mix of shame and relief flicker across his features. "I know. I just didn't know how to start." Evan exhaled slowly. "Is that all? Because it feels like something else is happening too. Something you're not saying." Marcus's gaze flicked away. "There's nothing else." But the hesitation, slight, almost imperceptible, struck a nerve in Evan. The doubt he had been trying to ignore bloomed again, tightening his chest. He thought of Calder's assessment, that painful truth spoken so confidently, "You're chasing the feeling of being wanted," and he hated how true it felt. Evan took a step back. "Marcus, are we okay?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'm trying, Evan. I'm trying to hold everything together." Evan heard the sincerity, but it didn't erase the ache inside him. Trying was not the same as reaching. Trying was not the same as being present. Trying was not the same as loving the way he used to. A knock at the door split the air. Marcus frowned. "Expecting someone?" Evan's breath hitched. No, he wasn't. But even before he reached the door, some instinct inside him whispered a name. When he opened it, the hallway air felt colder than it should have. Calder Knox stood there, his posture steady, his expression unreadable yet carrying a subtle urgency. He looked out of place in the warm glow of the apartment, like a shadow that had followed Evan home despite every reasonable boundary. Evan froze. "Calder, what are you doing here?" Marcus appeared behind Evan, confusion darkening his features. "Who is this?" The question hit Evan like a warning bell. The two worlds he had been balancing, Marcus's familiar distance and Calder's unsettling insight, were colliding, and he wasn't ready. Calder's gaze shifted briefly to Marcus before returning to Evan. "We need to talk," he said. "It's important." Marcus stepped forward, protective tension tightening his shoulders. "You can't just show up at our door." Calder didn't flinch. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't necessary." The calm in his voice only made Evan's heart pound harder. "About what?" Evan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Calder paused as if weighing the consequences of what he was about to say. "The Black Lanterns haven't forgotten your little challenge. They're not going after you, but they're curious. And curiosity can turn into danger fast." Marcus stared at Evan. "Challenge? What challenge?" Evan felt heat rush to his face. "It was nothing. I was upset. I made a mistake." "You went to them?" Marcus's voice cracked with disbelief. "Evan, what were you thinking?" Calder answered for him. He was thinking he needed something real. Something he wasn't getting. The words dropped like a weight in the room. Evan's breath caught. Calder, but Calder didn't retract the statement. He simply held Evan's gaze with a strange mixture of concern and something deeper, something Evan had no right to name. Marcus stiffened. You don't know us. No, Calder agreed, but I know what it looks like when someone feels alone beside the person they love. The honesty cut sharper than accusation. Evan turned away, covering his face with a trembling hand. The air felt too close, too charged. He could feel Marcus's hurt, Calder's intensity, and his own guilt crashing together in a storm that threatened to swallow him whole. Marcus's voice softened. Evan, was he right? Evan didn't answer. He couldn't, not without unraveling. Silence stretched between them, thick with truth. Finally, Calder stepped back from the doorway, his voice low. You're not safe if you keep drifting through this half alive. Not with the lanterns. Not with yourself. Evan looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means, Calder said, you need to decide what you're fighting for. And who? Before anyone could speak, Calder turned and walked down the hallway, each step fading into the distance until he vanished around the corner. His absence left an echo behind, a question made of equal parts danger and longing. Evan closed the door slowly, his hand lingering on the knob. He felt Marcus's eyes on him, heavy with uncertainty. The room suddenly felt too quiet, too fragile. Evan, Marcus whispered, tell me what's happening to us. Evan swallowed hard, realizing that whatever answer he gave would reshape everything. That he exhaled shakily. I don't know, he whispered, but I'm done running. And though neither of them knew what that meant yet or where it would lead, the story inside Evan's chest was finally shifting, toward truth, toward choice, toward whatever waited next in the uncertain dark.